Robin Hood Radio and the Robin Hood Radio Network is proud to present Leonard Lopate at Large, lively hour-long in-depth discussions providing overviews and context to topics usually covered in partial measures. His guests include leading thinkers, scientists, artists, economists, farmers, historians, authors, and politicians. Mr. Lopate is a Peabody Award winner whose numerous honors include 3 Associated Press Awards and 3 James Beard Awards.
Welcome to Leonard Lopate at Large. I'm Leonard Lopate. A number of America's finest forests are facing a new threat. Policymakers in the United States and Europe are promoting the use of biomass as a clean, carbon-neutral energy source, claiming that it will reduce CO2 emissions and slow climate change. But as we learn in a new documentary called Burned, Are Trees the New Coal? That's not really the case. Biomass comes from trees, and the rush is on to clear-cut old-growth forests, turn the felled trees into pellets, and ship most of them to Europe. As every schoolchild is told, forests are the planet's best carbon sequestration systems, and without them, climate change will accelerate. Joining me now for a discussion about biomass are Lisa Merton, the co-director of Burned with Alan Dader, Chris Hardee, the film's associate producer, and Dr. Mary S. Booth, director and ecosystems ecologist of Partnership for Policy Integrity. Dr. Booth appears throughout the documentary. Burned is distributed by New Day Films. I'm very pleased it has brought them to our show today. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having us.
Lisa, why is it called biomass?
Why is it called biomass? It's called biomass because it's made up of trees. It's made up of organic matter, branches, twigs. That's why it's called biomass, and it's a very benign-sounding term. And I think that's part of the problem. It's not like the word fracking, which is such a good, strong word. Biomass sounds really quite pleasant and good.
And in theory, it's all the stuff that you don't use elsewhere, like you said, twigs and stuff. But Mary, that's not the case, is it?
Yeah, the biomass industry started out burning residues from paper mills, that kind of thing, sawdust, leftover sludge from making paper. But with renewable energy incentives, both here in the U.S. and in Europe, it's become extremely lucrative to burn wood for energy, and they use whole trees. I mean, they quickly outstripped the amount of pellets and that kind of thing that could be made from true residues, and started harvesting whole trees.
In any case, doesn't burning wood emit lots of carbon?
Yeah, it emits a lot more carbon than burning even coal per unit energy generated. But it's treated under policy as if it has zero emissions.
Chris, where's most of the biomass industry wood pellet production being done?
Most of the pellet production is in the southeast of the wood basket of the country and even of the world. And we sort of feature that story in the film. And there's a particular pellet company in Viva that has grown up rapidly over the last 7 or 8 years or so.
Most of this wood is near the coastline, isn't it?
It's within 100 miles or so of the coast, and even further, because all of the pellets that are produced by Enviva and Georgia Biomass and other biomass pellet producers in the southeast are making the pellets for export to the EU and the UK.
Lisa, yeah, go ahead.
So they want it to be as close to the coast as possible for that reason.
Not because of the quality of the wood?
Mary, can you answer that one?
Well, the wood pellet industry has basically moved into the same territory that the pulp and paper industry has occupied for years. Of course, the U.S. Southeast is indeed one of the biggest wood baskets of the world. And there was a downturn in the pulp and paper industry, partly driven by the recession in 2008, that coincided with when the wood pellet industry was really starting to take off. So that explains why it's located where it is, and it's expensive to transport this stuff. It's heavy. So yeah, they do want to be close to the coast so that they can have these big export terminals where they load the pellets onto ships. But this U.S. Southeast isn't the only place where this is happening. Canada also has a really large wood pellet export industry. And Asia is getting interested in importing these, and right now Enviva does ship to Asia. But there are some companies that are looking at the West Coast to set up shop for wood pellet exports.
And in New England as well, as you point out, Berlin, New Hampshire.
Well, actually, Berlin is a domestic wood burner that generates electricity here in the U.S.
But they're not collecting the pellets. The reason I asked about its closeness to the Atlantic is you have Derb Carter in the film. He's the director of North Carolina's Office of Southern Environmental Law Office, and he talks about getting reports that vast wetland forests in eastern North Carolina were being cut to supply wood pellets to Europe. The wetland is irrelevant to this. It's just that's where they are.
The woodland is not at all irrelevant because they're incredibly carbon-rich forests, not just in the trees, but in the soils and the swamps. And they're also incredibly biodiverse. And they control flooding, and they supply the hatcheries for the place where fish go upstream to hatch. They're invaluable resources for the southeastern U.S. in terms of that climate change and what is happening now in terms of drought or too much water or the extremes that we're facing.
What did the biomass companies tell the residents who live near the forests?
I'm sorry, I didn't get that.
What did they tell the residents who lived near the forests? Did they warn them of some of the problems that might arise?
I don't think so. I don't think the biomass company cares a hoot about the residents, actually.
But they said we'll bring jobs.
Yes.
And then go behind the loggers, take the trash, keep everything
exactly.
green.
Yep. And that's not what they're doing.
How much?
They're taking whole trees and whole forests, and not just the bottomland hardwoods, but upland forests also. Alan and I drove at one point from Savannah, Georgia, to Lafayette, Louisiana, showing the film, and the southeast is being turned into a plantation of monoculture pine, loblolly pine. So they're losing not only their bottomland hardwoods, cypress, and forests there, but they're also losing their upland forests, which is devastating also.
Enviva Pellets of Southampton manufactures 750,000 metric tons of pellets each year. How many trees does that represent?
That's just at one of their plants.
Yeah. They're all over the South.
Yes.
This is millions of tons of trees per year, representing tens of thousands of acres of forests that are being cut. But I think it's important to note that the pulp and paper industry has long exploited southeastern forests, and what the wood pellet industry is doing now, it's created a market for some trees that were not otherwise marketable because the standards are lower for making something that you're going to burn than for making paper chips and certainly saw timber. So the amount of wood that the wood pellet industry is harvesting is small compared to the amount of wood that is harvested to make pulp and paper. But the difference is that this industry is growing pretty much exponentially, and it's growing based on a fallacy, which is that burning wood does not emit carbon, which of course it does. But because policy and lucrative renewable energy incentives are based on this idea that biomass is carbon neutral, it's causing this industry to explode. And we are literally liquidating large stands of forests in the name of mitigating climate change. It is a travesty, frankly.
How can it be carbon neutral if trees sequester carbon from the atmosphere through photosynthesis? If you're cutting them down, aren't you eliminating that process?
Yep, exactly. And it's basically an artifact of the way that carbon accounting and reporting is done at the international level, that this convention of treating bioenergy as if it's carbon neutral got imported into policy in a really unwise way. And seeing an opportunity, these companies moved in and set up shop. And, of course, then they became, giant job-creating monsters. And now nobody wants to change it because, this is jobs, this is commerce, this is industry. I mean, the State Department publishes reports about what they can do to increase wood pellet exports from the U.S. to the EU.
Has that been going on for a while? It doesn't matter who the president is?
That's correct. I'm sorry to say that the Obama administration was not exactly great on the bioenergy issue. They certainly were better than the Trump administration, but in a very real sense, environmentalists are somewhat responsible for sort of being asleep at the wheel when these policies were set up and this industry started really taking off. And the industry is really only about 10 years old. It's the first really big wood pellet exporting plant was finished in 2008 in Florida. And from there on, as I said, it's just grown exponentially.
Chris Bas-Eichhout of the Green Party Netherlands says calling biomass a carbon-neutral source was a completely political decision. Why?
The EU was trying to meet renewable energy quotas that they had set in a plan that was, I'm guessing, was a 10-year plan that was ending in 2020, and as part of that, biomass was considered renewable along with really true renewables like wind and solar. That's what he meant by that. He knows, he's smarter and knows that it's not really renewable in the same way and clean in the same way. It is a carbon emitter and it's polluting the atmosphere. So it was just a way to meet those quotas. And unfortunately, as they're putting together the 2030 plan for the next 10 years, they're making the same mistake.
Well, let's get into that whole renewable thing. Mary, the UK Department of the Environment issued a report that says the use of wood pellet biomass energy actually decreases the greenhouse gas footprint from 74 to 90%. What's that claim based on?
That claim is based on only counting the emissions from fossil fuels that are burned during manufacturing and transport of wood pellets, and not counting any of the CO2 that is emitted out the smokestack of the power plant that's actually burning the pellets.
Wait, let me see if I understand that. That would be the equivalent of saying that we're only counting the emissions that occur when we mine coal and move it to some place where we're going to ship it to another location, but not what happens when we burn the coal?
That's exactly right.
How could they do that?
Astonishing, huh?
Well, it's partially based in, as I said, a reporting convention that at the international level, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change set guidelines for how countries report their greenhouse gas emissions. And wood harvesting is counted as a land use change, and it's counted in the land use section of that reporting. And so to avoid double counting of those CO2 emissions from harvesting wood, power plants that burn the wood are not responsible for reporting the CO2 out the stack because it's already been counted as a loss of carbon from the land. And unfortunately, that reporting convention was incorporated into policy as if it was a physical reality. And even if countries are counting the carbon that's being lost as these trees are being cut down, there's no penalty for that. There's no consequence to that. It's like, oh well, we cut down some trees and there's less carbon standing on the land now. And meanwhile, these big incentives, these very, very lucrative incentives worth, in the UK, for instance, millions of pounds per year, are funneled through back to the pellet producers. The power plants can afford to pay a lot for the pellets. And so it's this chain of money. And so the incentives are all for cutting down the trees and none for letting the trees stand.
We're talking about the story told in a new documentary called Burned Are Trees, a New Coal, with Dr. Mary S. Booth, Director in Ecosystems, Ecologist of Partnership for Policy Integrity, Lisa Merton, the co-director of the film, and Alan Dater, and with Alan Dater, and Chris Hardee, the film's associate producer. You're listening to Leonard Lopate at Large on WBAI 99.5 FM in New York. Is carbon released when we cut trees, or is carbon only released when a tree rots or is burned?
The latter.
So
there can be soil disturbance and other ecosystem effects when you cut down trees. But yeah, the harvesting of trees is counted as an emission if they're cut for any reason by the IPCC. But then long-lived wood products are credited back. So if you cut down a tree, that's counted as an emission. But if you turn that tree into a table, that's counted as sequestration. So theoretically, if the accounting is done properly, all the carbon should be accounted for.
But what they're applying is what is come to be known as the carbon loophole?
Yeah, the not counting CO2 coming out the smokestack of a power plant that burns wood is known as the carbon loophole, the biomass loophole, yes.
But you can see right through this loophole. Why aren't people challenging it? Well, some people are challenging it. That's what we learned in the film. But why isn't it being challenged on a governmental level?
Well, the carbon is being counted as it's taken off the land in the U.S. when the trees are cut. I mean, it's counted in a weird way. It's not a very transparent and easy thing to see that in our carbon accounts. The problem is that just because you're counting it doesn't mean that doesn't stand up against the incentives that are being offered to drive this policy. So we're seeing an acceleration because of this policy that, the UK doesn't have to count the carbon coming out the stack when the pellets are burned. And it's bad policy. It's bad public policy. A lot of people know that. A lot of politicians know that. But as Chris pointed out, the UK, as part of the EU, still is obligated. All the EU countries set targets for the amount of renewable energy that they want to generate. And biomass currently accounts for about 65% of the renewable energy in the in the EU right now. And that includes liquid biofuels for transport that are made from agricultural products, as well as burning solid wood and byproducts of pulp and paper for electricity generation. But the point being that they're extremely dependent on this for meeting their targets, and there's actual consequences if they don't meet the targets.
Chris, isn't the UK's approach centered on converting old coal-fired power plants into being able to burn this wood biomass?
Was that directed at me?
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
Sure.
Before I go there, I just wanted to piggyback on what Mary had said. And, it is, you said, why isn't it transparent? It seems so transparent, and, the policy of counting seems complex. And another factor is just the sort of PR machine that's behind the industry. It's very similar to PR that's been done in sort of famous ways in recent history, one around sort of does smoking cause cancer, another around climate change, is the climate really changing? there's just powerful messaging that goes on, and this idea that that biomass is carbon neutral gets pushed out there so strongly, so consistently, that people who really do want to make the right decision, legislators, let's say, who don't have the time, aren't doing their homework maybe as diligently as they should, start believing it. And so it's not as transparent as it should be. And we're hoping that the film, in the visceral way that a film can tell a story that may be different than a newspaper article, sort of brings it home and makes it clear, and people come to understand it. I think awareness is a big part of what we tried to do in the film. I know 3 years ago when we started the film and Lisa and Alan invited me to participate, I considered myself a literate environmentalist. And I knew stuff about lots of issues, had sort of broad range of knowledge, kept in touch with things. And they said, would you like to work on a film about biomass? And I said, yeah, that sounds great. And I was thinking of this very green energy source. And in New England, it's sort of confounded by the fact that many of us burn wood, and biomass is also used for heating, which is another issue that we're not talking about in the film. We're talking about the generation of electricity. And I just thought this is a good thing, and quickly learned that this portion of that industry is just has impacts that I couldn't have imagined when I started.
Lisa,
so I didn't answer your question at all.
But it's okay.
I forget what it was.
Well, we're going to get on to the biggest player of burning biomass in the world, Drax Power Station, Selby, UK. Lisa, how much wood pellet does the Drax Power Station burn currently?
You know what? I don't have that figure on the top
I have it in front of me. It is
good.
7 million metric tons, and they're converting their plant. They're planning to go up to 15 million tons. And you interviewed the CEO of Drax about the power plant. What did she say?
No, we actually didn't. That was footage from Channel 4 from BBC.
You included stuff from because there are people in Britain, Channel 4, who are concerned about what's happening here?
Well, in that brief clip, it was clear that the CEO of Drax had no idea what their pellets were made up of. She said it was made up of twigs and branches, which is just not the case. And that was the reason that we had it in there, was to show how little she really knew about what was actually being burned in the plant that she was the head of, because it's actually whole trees, as you saw over and over again in the film.
Mary, didn't one study show that to create even 30% of the world's electric needs, we would need to cut down all of the world's forests?
Yeah, there's a few different figures out there. The shocking thing, though, is that many of the climate models that are now being run to kind of project how we're going to stay below dangerous temperature rise, some of those models also treat bioenergy as having zero emissions. And so the models conclude that burning biomass is an environmentally friendly thing to do, and they project even greater build-out of bioenergy than we're seeing now. So this is a huge problem that's not just a political problem. It's threaded through lots of climate mitigation modeling as well.
Is that why Drax is being subsidized for converting coal plants to wood biomass?
Yeah, the UK policy that favors conversion from coal to wood is part and parcel of this larger EU policy that does the same thing. I mean, the UK implemented it using, their own. They made up their own version of the policy, basically. But yeah, and Drax is huge. It's the biggest. That was a 3 gigawatt coal plant. When fully converted to wood, it would be less, because you can wring less energy out of wood than you can out of coal. In fact, I think some of their plans to do the full conversion now may be shelved, and they're talking about installing new natural gas burners at Drax. The UK government has
would
actually...
Would that be an improvement?
From a climate standpoint, no, not really. Solar panels would be an improvement, or wind, offshore wind. But the UK government has actually it recently put in place some new policies that will curtail the amount of subsidies that are available for new conversions, which is a good thing.
Chris, the wood pellets are shipped 3,800 miles from the United States to the UK. How can they justify that as carbon neutral?
Well, this is a short answer. I have no idea.
Well, that is some of the carbon that gets counted. So the UK government has a standard for how much carbon is allowed to be associated with these pellets. And as I said, they count the carbon that's emitted from fossil fuel burning during manufacturing and transport of the pellets. So they do actually count the CO2 that's emitted by burning oil in those big tankers that bring the pellets across the ocean.
Seth Ginther, the executive director of the U.S. Industrial Pellet Association, claims that biomass wood pellets release biogenic carbon, which isn't as bad as regular carbon. Isn't carbon carbon?
Yeah, carbon's carbon. The state of Massachusetts sued, EPA, and EPA lost, and that's when we started regulating CO2 as a pollutant in the U.S. And the finding of the court was, carbon is carbon. A molecule of carbon is the same and warms the atmosphere no matter where it comes from. The idea that biogenic carbon is somehow more favorable is actually based on the idea that those emissions will somehow be offset by something else happening at some other place and some other time. Trees are growing somewhere and taking carbon out of the air, and therefore if we're burning trees now, Seth Ginther would argue we shouldn't count those emissions.
But if we cut down trees and replace them with new ones, won't it take a long time for those new trees to actually offset the loss?
Yes, but the argument that the U.S. Industrial Pellet Association makes, and also Enviva and many other pellet proponents, and this is part of the misinformation campaign that Chris was referring to, they want you to believe the fact that trees are growing somewhere and taking up carbon somewhere is enough to offset the increased emissions from burning wood.
Go ahead.
It makes no sense mathematically. I mean, no one would ever tolerate that kind of argument for their bank account, for instance, that, you can spend down your entire bank account, but, the bank is still making interest somewhere on someone else's account, and therefore, you can spend down all your capital and it won't matter. That's the same argument, essentially. The forest, what we refer to as the forest carbon sink, accounts for taking up about 10% of the U.S.'s emissions each year. Forests take up the equivalent of about 10% of our CO2 that we emit. And that is literally our only carbon sink. It's all bad news other than that. Cutting it down and burning it makes no sense at all.
When do trees begin to sequester carbon? Can we assume that a sapling planted by a biomass company sequesters the same amount of carbon as a 200-year-old tree that's been cut down?
No, of course not.
No way.
But isn't that the math that they're using?
First of all, they don't replant. Biomass companies don't replant because they don't own the land that they're harvesting from. They work with the people who do the harvesting, but they don't actually own the land. So whether trees are being replanted or not, we don't actually know. And on native forests, on hardwood forests, those are not replanted. Those we rely on natural regeneration for those. Whereas if the wood is sourced from a pine plantation, those are typically replanted. But this is the idea that trees are growing. We may be harvesting them here in North Carolina, but trees are growing in California. So we'll take credit for that carbon sequestration. That's the argument that they're making.
It happens that they're cutting them in California, too. Yeah.
One of the people you interview says the only green, talking about this as a green thing, the only green is the amount of money being made in response to a European policy that makes no sense.
Yeah, that's Derb Carter.
But people are saying that this is a green policy.
They are saying it's a green policy. Yeah.
This is Leonard Lopate at Large. Who is Ken Roberson?
Kent Roberson is a man whose daughter we met in a restaurant in North Carolina. I can't remember the town exactly right now, and she was asking us why we were there, and we said, well, we're making a film about the biomass industry, and she said, you should go talk to my dad, because they wanted him to cut down, they wanted to take all his trees, and he wouldn't let them. All of his neighbors went and sold off their trees, and they regretted it. You need to go talk to my dad. So that's kind of the way things happen when you're making a documentary film. You talk to people, and they say, oh, you got to talk to this person, you got to talk to that person. So we went and visited Kent, and it was interesting what he had to say. It really was. He loved his small piece of forest, and what was interesting to me was that he remembered that it had been cut. All the land around him had been cut 3 times during his lifetime. So probably he was probably in his 60s. So, every 20 years, there's this cut that takes place. And that's what Alan and I experienced when we were driving across from Savannah to Lafayette, Louisiana, was that the forest was in one stage or another of, it was newly planted, it was about to be cut, or it was, just harvested. And it was interesting to see that it really was this monoculture of growth and regrowth. Growth and being cut, and just the towns were devastated. There was a food desert. There were no supermarkets. The towns were all boarded up. There was nothing. It was a very eye-opening trip to see how degraded the environment had become.
Diverse hardwood forests had ended up being replaced with pine.
Exactly.
And Ken says that he doesn't regret his decision to not allow it to happen, but his neighbors do. And also, there's the whole matter of living near the forest because there's constant noise. There are trucks going back and forth all the time. There's a lot of dust. Is that the reason that these small communities are suffering? People don't want to live there?
I think that's part of the reason. There's no investment in these communities. There's not a McDonald's. There's nothing. The land is so degraded. As Dana says from Dogwood Alliance, Dana Smith, she says, if logging were a way to make the South whole again, we'd be one of the richest places in the world because we're ground zero for industrial logging. And it's been that way for decades, first, as Mary pointed out, for paper and pulp, and now for biomass.
Mary, Alan Weekly, the director of the University of North Carolina Herbarium, he says that there's an important distinction to be made between natural and semi-natural forests, which are typically pine plantations. What's the difference?
Well, particularly for those southeastern forests, the native forests there are literally some of the most carbon-rich and biodiverse forests in North America. If you look at a map of carbon density of North America, that's a real hot spot, partly because some of those forests are bottomland wetland forests, and they're just crawling with life, and big trees. And then, obviously, also the upland forests are equally gorgeous and diverse and full of wildlife. So when these get cut down and replaced with essentially a monoculture of, genetically identical pines that are grown, to be straight and tall and, yield a lot of wood and grow quickly, all these traits that were bred for the pulp and paper industry, and they're just planted in rows, and they get fertilized and they get herbicided, and so it's just a very sterile industrial landscape compared to the diversity that a natural hardwood forest has.
And Mary, isn't there a thing called futurogene?
Yes, there's genetic manipulation going on to breed even faster growing trees that the pulp and paper industry, and particularly actually the liquid biofuels industry, is very interested in wood fibers that can be broken down easily. Liquid biofuels in this country are mostly made from either the corn, the fruit of the corn, the seed of the corn, or to some extent from the cellulosic part of the corn, the leaves and the stems. But the biofuels industry is very interested in using wood as feedstock. And it's just hard to break down wood to make liquid biofuels. So they'd really like to genetically engineer trees that are easier to break down. If that industry takes off, it's going to make the current wood demand for the wood pellet industry look like just a warm-up.
Chris, the film also moves to Berlin, New Hampshire, which, like many New England communities, suffered when paper pulp mills closed up shop. Berlin is home now to New England's largest wood chip burning biomass electric plant. And that's because the politicians, the mayor especially, are really hot for this?
Yeah, that's all true. Before saying that, I just want to say that nice choice of interstitial music. Lisa and I were enjoying the song there a couple of minutes ago.
We try to please.
Back to Berlin, though. There's a very interesting drama going on in New Hampshire. I'm a New Hampshire resident, actually. Lisa and Alan live across the river in Vermont, and the plant in Berlin, the Burgess biomass plant, is the biggest one in New England. It's a 75-megawatt plant. There's 6 other, I believe, smaller biomass electricity generating facilities in New Hampshire, and they've all been subsidized in the years that they've been in service.
So they can't make a profit if there are no government subsidies?
Exactly right, and that's true for Drax in the UK too. And they've enjoyed that free ride, most of them being owned by venture capitalists or equity firms, many of them in New Hampshire, out of state, even out of country. And so the owners are reaping the rewards, the ratepayers are paying the bills. Just a couple of weeks ago, the Republican governor of New Hampshire vetoed a subsidy bill that had been approved by the legislature. And there's a big brouhaha right now with a vote in mid-September to either override or sustain that veto. So kind of strange bedfellows now. For some reason, the Democrats are falling on the side of the job argument. The Republicans are saying we'd really like a free market, which kind of makes sense from their standpoint. And we're trying to get the film out to as many audiences in New Hampshire as possible. We had planned our screening tour for New Hampshire for the fall. For September, we've moved a couple of our screening dates forward. We're meeting with people. We're trying to get it in front of legislators. I've been talking to my local legislators in the southwest corner of New Hampshire. So, this subsidy thing is a big deal. It's the same story has played out in Maine as well, where the governor is there, again, a conservative, rejected this latest subsidy bill, and saying we gave you 3 years of subsidies or whatever it was before, and we haven't seen anything for it. We're not going to give you a free ride anymore. And the logging industry and the timberland businesses are all complaining. what happened specifically, just to end this story in New Hampshire, is that within a week of that veto of the subsidies, 3 of the 6 smaller plants in New Hampshire said they would shutter soon. So immediately they saw the writing on the wall. Now forces have really organized in the state to try to override the veto. So we'll see what's going to happen.
Maine
I'll
Senator.
just jump in here and just to say about the subsidies. There's renewable energy subsidies that electricity ratepayers pay extra on their electric bill, and those credits get swapped around among different states. So if you live in the East Coast, you might be buying wind energy from Kansas, for instance. But those wood burners in northern New England were selling renewable energy credits down into other states and making money doing that. But then there's these additional subsidies that are actually increased cost for the actual megawatt hours of electricity. And that Berlin plant, there was a controversy last year because some court documents were unsealed that revealed that the extra cost just for the Berlin plant was going to cost ratepayers over $100 million. Because the Public Utilities Commission had entered into a deal with the plant. So they are getting subsidies both directly as renewable energy subsidies, which accompanies the electricity payment, and then the electricity itself costs more. And then in Maine, that bailout was just more money that was voted by the legislature. It was $13.4 million to be split among 4 plants or something. And that money was just sort of distributed around like, monopoly money or something.
But Maine Senator Susan Collins is a big proponent of biomass, and she quotes studies and reports that say it's carbon neutral, clean, sustainable, economically viable. And she was speaking on behalf of an amendment to a federal legislation.
That's right.
What was that? What's the amendment? Is
so
that the Clean Power Plan?
It was basically that the Clean Power Plan was being proposed. It was Obama's plan to reduce emissions from fossil fuel burning plants. And one of the proposals in there was to allow wood burning to be treated as carbon neutral and to replace, that would be how they would quote unquote reduce emissions, is by replacing coal with wood. And basically EPA got sued on a different matter, a permitting matter, which forced them to start counting CO2 from biomass. And the court, in fact, this is an interesting aside, Brett Kavanaugh, our Supreme Court nominee, was on the federal court, the 3-judge court, that said there's no basis in the Clean Air Act for treating biogenic CO2 any different from regular CO2, from fossil CO2. So that's an interesting aside. He was very much a literalist in that case as well. But so the senators who were very pro-bioenergy, and that included Angus King, Susan Collins, and some others, basically wrote an amendment which got put into an appropriations bill and has been extended for a couple of years now, that forces EPA to treat biomass as having zero emissions, despite what the science says.
Now,
and this is just basically Susan Collins. It may be great on a lot of things, but in this regard, she is very much. I see her very much as a mouthpiece of the wood products industry and the biomass industry. And in fact, we did a little film a couple of years ago of her giving a floor speech where she was reading word for word, basically a biomass industry website paragraph, and
that's in Burned also.
Yeah.
Well, one of the most striking moments in the film is when an EPA representative says, quote, "From an economic perspective, if a tree isn't cut for paper or biomass, there's really no need for the forest."
Yeah, he's actually not an EPA representative. He's a wood. He's from RISI. He's an industry insider. That guy.
Oh, well, I feel a little better then.
He prefaced that by saying, "I don't really know what the EPA. I don't know what the EPA does." And then he made that statement, which was really, everybody just when they hear that they just guffaw.
That's the biggest laugh line in the film consistently.
Yeah.
We're talking with about a documentary called Burned, Are Trees the New Coal? With Lisa Merton, who is co-director of it, with Alan Dater, Chris Hardee, who is the associate producer of the film, and Dr. Mary S. Booth, director and ecosystems ecologist of Partnership for Policy Integrity. This is WBAI in New York, 99.5. We don't have a lot of time, but I want to cover another thing, that this film has a lot of stuff in it. And there's a biomass plant in Lance, Michigan that burns more than just wood chips. Lance Warden Electric Company, they're burning railroad ties that have been treated with PCB, chip rubber tires, and other types of post-industrial materials. And that's perfectly legal? Is this another scandal along the lines of what happened with Flint and its water supply?
That plant is a particularly filthy plant. PFPI, my organization, did an analysis, and per megawatt hour, that was actually the dirtiest plant in Michigan, which is really saying something. Biomass is broadly defined, and there is a lot of stuff being burned in power plants in this country that would really scare people if they knew what it was. These are basically industrial incinerators, but they're not regulated as incinerators because of lobbying by the Treated Wood Council and other industry entities. They've made it so that these things like creosote-treated, PCP-treated wood can be burned with very little regulation. In fact, those PCP-treated ties were being brought down from Canada, and when we alerted Region 4 of EPA, Region 5 EPA, what was going on there, they actually brought an enforcement action against that plant because they were really getting away with a lot up there.
They're burning known carcinogens. Are they monitoring the air quality? Is anyone monitoring the air quality?
No.
The film also deals with something along those lines, fugitive release. The residents of the area sent the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality videos of fugitive release. And how did the department respond?
Well, that did get changed, actually. That one element of what they were, they used to blow the chips from the place where they chipped them down to the mill. I mean, to the plant, and they did fix that.
Although the Department of Environmental Quality called the fugitive releases a nuisance.
Yeah,
that's
kind of
dismissing
move away because of them. I mean, people moved. People chose to move because they were literally covered in this fine dust from the PCP-treated railroad ties.
One resident observes, "You and I aren't able to burn rubber tires and railroad ties. Why are corporations allowed to do so?"
That is a very good question.
We have a need to incinerate stuff, and the incineration, the burning industry loves it when they can, in addition to getting paid tipping fees for getting rid of this stuff, if they can also earn renewable energy subsidies, so much the better. So there's an awful lot of stuff in different states that is counted as biomass, including a lot of contaminated wood, that when it's burned, it generates lucrative energy subsidies for these companies.
Lisa, at the end of the film, you quote UK officials as saying, "You don't understand. If we don't count this as zero, we can't meet our obligations to the EU." Does that mean it's unlikely that the accounting errors that we discussed earlier will be fixed?
It does look unlikely. I mean, they just voted in January to continue counting burning biomass as carbon neutral, right, Mary? That's what happened.
Essentially, that's what the outcome was, yeah.
But Chris, isn't the UK decreasing its investment in wind and solar power?
I don't know the answer to that question.
Well, that is one of the problems with biomass is that it directly affects subsidies for true renewables like wind and solar. So it's you have trees that are sequestering carbon. When you burn them, they're putting that carbon immediately into the atmosphere. When you have solar panels, which are 20% efficient, they're going to be making them even 25% efficient. The trees are standing. The sun is creating energy, and it's so much more efficient than burning biomass.
The question that keeps on occurring to viewers is, if the government's environmental regulators won't protect the citizens, who will?
That's what a lot of people ask in those hearings in Lance, Michigan, isn't it?
But you saw the people who the environmental the members of the Department of Environmental Quality, they were kind of dismissive of all the citizens' complaints.
I agree with you. I was astounded by how dismissive they were. I would say that they were much more on the side of the industry than they were of the people who were complaining. And I think it's out of sight, out of mind. I mean, they're up there on Lake Superior. Who the hell cares about them? They're way up there. Doesn't matter. They got plenty of clean air up there. I mean, it's just they were really dismissive. They were rude, I thought, actually. How little they seemed to care about the citizens of those communities surrounding that plant.
So while they're being dismissive, I'd have to say I'm thankful that there are the sorts of activists that we followed in the film, the Dogwood Alliance in the South. Mary Booth, who has spent the last so many years of her life devoted to this issue, and many, many others who, do the hard work. And the tactics for how you counteract that dismissiveness is all kinds of things, from scientifically vetted reports to activists in the street who make a lot of noise, and they're all important. And I'm just, having made the film and followed people like that around, I'm amazed by the things that people do to try to sort of right the environmental wrongs that are being done.
Bill McKibben says in your film, climate change is the final exam in testing whether the big brain was a good idea and if it was connected to a big enough heart. What do you think he means by that?
Well, I think, first of all, he's completely right about it being the issue of our time. It might be the last issue of our time.
He's saying we're intellectualizing this instead of really thinking about what is really happening?
I think so, and I also think that, in the Northern Hemisphere, we go along as normal, and we're hugely, the amount of resources and energy that we're using and creating terrible emissions from is hugely affecting those who live in the Southern Hemisphere. It's they're the ones at this point who are being affected to the largest degree. And we're talking people here, and ecosystems, of course, as well. But I think that he is talking about compassion. He is talking about the heart and understanding what we're doing to people who don't have it as well off as we do, people who are really living close to the ground and dependent on the land for their survival.
Where can
to
people...
To that point of the climate being the issue of our time, I hope that all of your listeners, who I'm sure are well educated,
smartest listeners in America.
What?
We have the smartest listeners in America.
The New York Times article, Losing Earth, from the Sunday Magazine yesterday. Nathaniel Rich's sort of very detailed history of what happened when we were trying to rectify the climate trajectory that we were on between 1979 and 1989. It's a very long article. It's an investment of time. For even someone like me who knows a lot about it, it was tremendously sobering. And I would just say, just read the intro and the epilogue if that's all you read.
Well, that does it for this week's show. Leonard Lopate at Large comes to you on Saturdays at 4 and Tuesdays at noon. You can subscribe to Leonard Lopate at Large podcast on iTunes and by clicking on Robin Hood Radio's archive program site, which is robinhoodradio.com. You can also check out Leonard Lopate at Large Facebook page. We hope to see you next week.